Am I just my brain? Do we have an immaterial mind? But how can we say that we have an immaterial mind when we are able to control actions and thoughts by merely passing an electrode to the brain? If this is intriguing for you, surely don't go anywhere. Welcome to SAFT Podcast. And if this is your first time listening or watching, stay subscribed. And if you enjoy our work, do share and review our content on your favorite listening platforms. And do stick around. We have some amazing content rolling out for you. And today I am joined by Dr. Sharon Dirckx. Dr. Sharon, welcome to SAFT Podcast.
It's a pleasure.
Dr. Sharon is a senior tutor at OCCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. She has a PhD in brain imaging from the University of Cambridge and has held research positions at the University of Oxford and the Medical College of Wisconsin, USA. Her books are Why, Looking at God, Evil, and Personal Suffering, and that book and the topic that we're discussing today, Am I Just My Brain? Sharon, your book has generated a lot of response among both the lay and also the expert audiences who are diving into these questions. So what does the book, Am I Just My Brain, really cover?
Yeah, thank you. It's really asking a central question about human identity. What exactly are we? There are all kinds of explanations offered out there as to what we are. And one of the explanations coming out is that we are our brains. We are driven by our neurons. Everything that makes us us is ultimately a product of the activity of our brains. And so I really am wanting to respond to that from neuroscience. Actually, you don't have to step far beyond and even within the realm of neuroscience to say that actually clinical neuroscience is showing that simply physical descriptions alone are not enough to explain human beings, that we are far more complex than simply physical processes, although those are an important part of it. And so really I take the book in that direction.
Yeah, and when we start this discussion about brain and mind, I guess we can go and maybe take mind and consciousness synonymously, because many people hold consciousness to be part of the mind. But let's try and explain what brain and mind is all about. What do we mean by the terms brain and mind?
Yes, so brain means the physical organ that sits inside your skull, both in terms of its structures of, axons and cell bodies and dendrites and synapses, and then all of the kind of the movement in amongst those in terms of neurotransmitters and chemicals and electrical activity and hormonal activity. So by brain, I mean the physical processes in your head, both structural and functional.
Yeah, and so when we use the term mind, what are we meaning there? Obviously, it's not the same thing as we just talked about the brain. It's different. So what is different about the mind?
So by mind, we mean all of the kind of subjectively experienced things concerned with memories, thoughts, feelings, and emotions. There's an inner reality to every human being. As Thomas Nagel put it in 1974, there is something that it is like to be you. That no one else quite knows in the same way, unless they were to ask you.
Right.
And so how do we make sense of this inner reality, and what is its relationship to the physical brain? And that is really the million-dollar question that this whole conversation hangs on. What is the relationship between the mind and the brain, and how do these two things relate to each other? In terms of consciousness, I think there are different people. People would hold different views on this. For the purposes of this discussion, it might, many just consider those two things to be synonymous, but others might consider consciousness to be a property of the mind, that there are conscious states that sit under the umbrella of mind. But it probably depends who you ask.
Yeah. And so I was just thinking, When we use the term limbs, we would just throw both our forelimbs and hand limbs under the category of limbs, though they both serve different functions and are placed differently and have different characteristics. Uh, you and other neuroscientists out there would definitely advise against using a single term to combine both brain and mind interactions. What is the core reason that we do not want to equate the brain and mind, though they both mingle and sort of work side by side?
Well, I think that the whole notion of wanting to collapse those two things is operating on the presumption that the mind is a physical entity, and that is far from decided. In fact, the relationship between brain and mind, or in the ancient world, body and soul, has been debated for centuries, and actually there have always been those who argue that mental states, that consciousness, that soul is not physical. Of course, there are those that argue it's an emergent property from the physical today, and we can say more about that later. But it's not a foregone conclusion that the mind is a physical thing. In fact, if you start to dig into human beings and what the clinic is showing, we begin to see that the brain alone is really not sufficient to account for the fullness of human experience. Imagine we were to do an experiment to figure out what it is like for you to revise for your next set of exams or to be audited at work. And we were to set an EEG cap on your scalp and measure electrical activity projected from deep in your brain to the surface of your scalp 24/7 for a few days. And we were to put you in an MRI scanner and collect some structural scans and some functional scans. We get some really interesting data from your brain. But would that tell us what it is like for you to revise for your next set of exams or to be audited at work?
Right.
Well, of course, it wouldn't be able to tell us that kind of information. We need to ask what it is like to cope with expectations and stress and workload and all of those things that your brain activity is not going to tell us. And so we don't really have to dig very far into real life, to see that there's something very different between the notion of brain and the notion of mind. Philosophers refer to the term qualia, that life is full of these qualitative experiences that we have, and these are impossible to describe physically. If I were to ask you to describe to me the smell of coffee in physical terms, what might you say? You might offer me the chemical structure of caffeine, but that doesn't get me any closer to the smell of coffee.
Yeah.
Or you might describe the physical processes as you drink the coffee and digest it, but that doesn't get me any closer to the smell of coffee. If you want to understand the smell of coffee, you need to smell it, and no physical description gets you any closer to that. And that's really what we're getting at in this whole conversation, that brain processes alone are not enough to account for human experience, human consciousness. And so there are all kinds of other things I could say. Philosophers such as David Chalmers have distinguished between the hard and easy problems of consciousness, where they they talk about easy problems, which are not easy by any stretch, but compared to the hard problem, they're trivial. He describes easy problems as those like looking at structures and functions that are turned on and off when you move from one state of consciousness to another, such as wakefulness to sleep or wakefulness to being under anesthetic. But that's a very different kind of question compared to the hard question, which is trying to account for what something is like. Why do we have this inner reality?
Yeah.
And so even neuroscientists that have no belief in God, or a very different kind of belief in God, would argue that mind and brain are two very different things, and that starting just with the physical building blocks and trying to build a case for mind and consciousness from there is not going to get you there, because you keep running up against this hard problem of consciousness. How do physical systems get you to experience? Well, there is no clear-cut answer to that. Despite throwing the best and brightest minds at it for many centuries, there is no consensus on how what the relationship is between mind and brain.
Yeah, right. And so we realize that there is this hard problem to ask about the experience. And obviously, in the scientific arena, just because something is hard or complex doesn't discourage someone from pursuing or looking and trying to explore it. But to a neuroscientist, is the concept of a mind too abstract to engage with? Or as a neuroscientist, do they say, well, we're just going to focus more on the brain and not worry about the experiences or the immaterialness of a mind that many people posit? Is that something that you as a neuroscientist have encountered, or do you see neuroscientists posting that sort of a stance?
Well, I think that in order to, I think there is so many different things we could say to that. I mean, I suppose that neuroscience has many different facets. Its primary aim is to study the function of the brain, the processes in the brain. And they do that very well. And we have all kinds of studies of what the sort of neural correlates of various different mental states or behavioral patterns or drug effects might be on the human brain. And this was my bread and butter for over a decade. But of course, in order to kind of piece that into a holistic understanding of human beings, we need to not just be looking at human beings through one lens. And that's the problem with this reductive physicalist approach to human beings, to say that those kind of explanations on their own can explain the mind is not enough. And that's why, and we saw a neglect of the psychological sciences for many centuries, precisely on well, partly on this basis, or partly from seeing it as being something that is untouchable or unknowable. And it's only been since we have really recognized that the mind is its own thing that we've really begun to make progress in things like how to treat mental health, which is reaching an all-time kind of crisis point, people's mental health. And so I think if we begin to look outwards to the real world, we see that the mind is altogether real and incredibly powerful in its effects on the brain and the body. And in fact, again, we could go to clinical neuroscience to see this. And scientists talk about this concept known as downward causation, where mental processes have a powerful effect downwards onto the physical structures of the brain. So one example is a landmark brain imaging study by Eleanor Maguire of London taxi drivers. I believe it was in 2006, or it might have been earlier. And London taxi drivers have to memorize the layout of London, something called the knowledge. And for that, they use their working memory. And the physical structures involved in working memory in the brain, one of them is the hippocampus. And so they measured the size of the hippocampus as these taxi drivers went through the process of memorizing the layout of London. And they compared them with London bus drivers who didn't need to memorize the layout of London at all. And they saw that in the taxi drivers, the hippocampus grew significantly as they used their working memory. The same thing didn't happen in the bus drivers. And what this shows us is that mental processes, these higher cognitive processes, are having a physical effect on the brain. And that's a process known as downward causation. Another example would be the placebo effect, which is a well-known clinical phenomenon. If you're given a blank drug that you believe will help, it will have some therapeutic benefit on your physical body. This is another example to say that the mind, your mental processes, mental states are powerful in their effects downwards back onto the body and brain. And that's another reason to argue that mind and brain are two very distinct things that need to be treated as such. And our job is to figure out, is not to collapse them, but to figure out how they relate to one another.
So then So the whole point of how the mind interacts with the brain and how mind interacts with the nerval interactions of our body, us feeling pain, and that causing us not just a physical reaction of in the form of inflammation, but also us impacting our mood and our condition at that point. So that just it's a very complex field for someone like me to ask the question of how exactly does something immaterial like a mind interact with the brain. So that leads us to the question, is the mind seated in the brain, and what goes on? What do we know so far about the interaction between the mind and the brain?
Yes, well, one of the points that I make in my book is that it really depends who you ask. Again, your very question presumes physicalism, and we're just seeing this all the time. There's a presumption that it must all be residing in the brain, and what we need to be really clear on is what the science tells us and what it doesn't tell us. What the science clearly tells us is that mind and brain are causally connected.
Right.
If you put someone in an MRI scanner and give them a working memory task to do, you see networks to do with working memory light up. Clearly, mental states and physical states and brain states are connected. Mind and brain are causally connected. They are correlated. That is clear. But very often that is used as a springboard to then say, well, they must be synonymous. They must be the same thing. And essentially the view that you are your brain is saying that the mind is the brain, that the chemical reaction is the mental state.
Right.
And my aim in the book I wrote, Am I Just My Brain?, is to say, look, that doesn't explain human beings in all of their fullness. It offers you a diminished view of humanity.
Yeah.
It also raises some very serious questions for the implications for free will, for what would ultimately be possible with AI, for ethics and how we view human beings. Do we give priority to those with a fully functional, healthy brain, if that is the be all and end all? I guess these sort of reductive physicalist approaches are trying to explain human beings just through one lens, to say that purely physical descriptions can explain everything, that mental, and they're essentially saying that the mind is the brain, that mental states are brain states, mental processes are brain processes. But my aim in the book that I wrote, which is called Am I Just My Brain?, is to say that that doesn't offer you the best way of looking at human beings. That doesn't make best sense of how we seem to live, what clinical neuroscience is showing us. And there are other ways of viewing the relationship between the mind and brain that make better sense of both of those things. One of those views is that the mind emerges from the brain, and this is looking at the ideas that come from emergentist thinking, and also non-reductive physicalist approaches, which say that when a number of component parts come together, something new comes into being that is greater than the sum of those original building blocks, and that cannot be reduced back to those, although it is dependent on them, because it is an emergent property of a physical system. And that's a little bit like, a film is made up of a number of component parts, a director, actors, a script, a soundtrack, and so on. But the experience of the film is something that is greater than the sum of its kind of component parts. So that's a little trying to sort of capture a little bit of that view that I dig into, that the mind emerges from the brain. Another possibility is that the mind is beyond the brain, and that's really getting at the substance dualist view, which says that there's a physical brain and a non-physical mind. These two things are distinct, but they do interact very closely. And of course, that view would say that your mind is not seated in your brain, and in fact, it can't be located. And so that's a very broad. There's also the panpsychist view, which is an attempt to really say that any attempt to start with physical building blocks is redundant. And really you need to begin with consciousness and build a bridge back to brain and physical systems from there. And Chalmers and Thomas Nagel and others are beginning to voice the panpsychist view. So that, I guess that is saying kind of mind is everything. Everything possesses elements of consciousness that increase in complexity as the systems increase. So that's another view that is out there. So it's only one or two views that would say that mind is located in or near the brain. The science shows us that they're correlated, but to draw conclusions about the nature of the interaction is stepping beyond the realm of science and into philosophy. And we need to recognize when we make that transition. That's a really important thing for this conversation.
Yeah. And so when I was thinking about what has been the normal response from someone like a proper neuroscientist and not a philosopher looking into the question, what has been the response from a neuroscientist to the question of the interaction between the mind and brain and whether there is a distinction between the mind and brain, I stumbled across this passage from Wilder Penfield from his book, The Mystery of the Mind. And I'm not going to get into the entire quote due to limitation of time, but he mentions in pages 76 and 80 about this experiment that he did with the patient, where he would apply an electrode to the motor cortex of one hemisphere, and that would make this conscious patient to move his hand. And then he would make the patient make noise through the same process to vocalize him. And he notes that in both those instances, the patient says that, I didn't do that, you did. And then he goes into the extent where he enables the patient to recall a stream of memories from the past. And he records that the patient still would say that the surgeon was responsible for the phenomenon, even though he was recognizing the details of his own past experience. And then the great Wilder Penfield comes to conclude in page 80, he says that, for my own part, after years of striving to explain the mind on the basis of brain action alone, I have come to the conclusion that it is simpler and far easier and logical if one adopts the hypothesis that our being does consist of two fundamental elements. And it was very fascinating to see for him to look at it and ask and say the same thing that you said about how reducing it to just the brain leaves so many gaps in the theory that we are positing. And you just mentioned one example of asking the question about what does coffee taste like, the distinction between us experiencing heat in our tongue, but also the sense of taste which we can't experience, and waking up, memorizing the brain activity or mental states and all of that. And here is a neuroscientist looking at the same experimentation and saying, I look at it, and the best explanation so far, and sort of in a philosophical sense, diving into philosophy, he says the best explanation so far is to say the mind and brain are distinct, and our being consists of two fundamental elements. Now, I'm asking to the neuroscientist in you, as a neuroscientist, what would be maybe a quick experimentation or maybe a quick data from your mind that you would pull up to show to a person that science does show that we have good reasons to think that we have a mind? Is there anything that quickly comes to your mind that would appeal to a neuroscientist who might be listening to this podcast?
I mean, there are all kinds of books out there on this topic. You don't have to dig too far, but I mean, there are some very interesting. I do unpack some of them in Am I Just My Brain? That would be a great starting point to kind of, for a sort of an introduction to the topic, and there are a number of references from there. But there are some very interesting data sets out there in clinical neuroscience that highlight precisely what Wilder Penfield was seeing, which is that human beings are highly complex, and there is always data that is so surprising and that actually gives us pause for thought and cause to kind of question and just really think about things. Now, one example would be a study that was conducted by Professor Adrian Owen and published in the prestigious journal Neuroscience in 2006, where they studied patients in a persistent vegetative state and were able to make contact with a very small number of these patients that were showing no outward signs of consciousness, and were able to train them to answer a series of biographical questions using their mind. They were able to say, look, if imagine you're playing tennis.
Right.
And if you imagine you're playing tennis, a network of areas to do with motor movement and control light up in your brain. And then they said, imagine you're moving around your house at home. And if they do that, a number of areas to do with spatial navigation light up. And then they would ask them a series of questions and say, if you want to answer yes to this question, imagine you're playing tennis. And if you want to answer no to this question, imagine you're moving around your house at home. And they asked them biographical questions that could be verified by family members. And a very small number of these patients answered every single question correctly, showing that despite significant damage to their brain, they were showing levels of consciousness, obviously not the same levels compared with a healthy human being, but way more than we even just a few decades ago thought was happening in a person of that in that condition. And so this gives us pause for thought. It reminds us human beings are highly complex. Another data set is of near-death experiences, which is very vast. And there's one particular account called Proof of Heaven by Eben Alexander, who was originally a physicalist and a Harvard neuroscientist, and really dismissive of his own patients. He was a neurosurgeon, and his patients had come to him after surgery and recounted experiences of consciousness in their surgery despite being in a state of clinical death. And he was very dismissive until he had a bacterial meningitis that almost ended his life in, I think, about 10 years ago. And he went into a very, very deep coma. His family were told to put their affairs in order. He wasn't expected to survive, and miraculously pulled through and described this very, very vivid experience, despite the fact that the vast majority of the brain, the parts of the brain known to be associated with consciousness, had shut down entirely. And he drew some very powerful conclusions that consciousness continues beyond the grave, and that and went on to very dramatically change his view from strict physicalist to really there's more going on here. And this is really what we see when we start to look at people, take it out of the realm of pure philosophy and pure neuroscience into the clinic and into human beings. We see that there's so much more going on. And this is another thing that I try to draw out in my book, that any persuasive account of the relationship between mind and brain has to take account of the complexity that we see in the clinic. Yeah.
And for those listening, if you would like to see an exciting talk from Gary Habermas on how NDEs prove against naturalism, check out our friends at the Carpenter's Desk. They've got an exciting talk on this. And the reason I asked about what evidence would you give a neuroscientist for the existence of a mind was, I came across one post by a cosmologist from India, and he was citing Sir Roger Penrose's contribution towards quantum consciousness, and that he was trying to show that the mind therefore is material and now is solely the field of inquiry of physics, and philosophy cannot do anything there. And so he was trying to not only make his case that the mind is material, but rather he wanted to shift it completely from any sort of philosophical engagement and purely into a physical talk. What's happening with Sir Roger Penrose's position on quantum consciousness? Maybe it's too deep for us to dive in. We don't have much time. But what's happening behind the scene? What is he doing in a topic of consciousness?
Yeah, well, I mean, Roger Penrose's work is very, very interesting. And I know that he and others have place an emphasis on microtubules and their kind of role in possibly contributing towards some sort of quantum coherence that would be necessary for consciousness. But again, I think I don't want to be misunderstood here. I think a neuroscience of consciousness and physical systems is vital.
Right.
And biophysics, such as the kind that Penrose is referring to, is vital in this conversation. But we have seen over the last decades and centuries that physical explanations alone are not enough to explain human consciousness. The material cannot get you to experience. And we need to recognize what science can and cannot tell us. Science can talk about the different areas that are contributing to mental states, but we will never be asked. I mean, I think it would be unwise to want to at some point collapse that mental state purely into a physical system. I think we're seeing that the importance of mental states is really vital in how we understand human beings. And for that, we need to reach out to other areas as well. And so people I think, views like panpsychism are helpful in the sense that they at least put consciousness as primary and say, look, we need to start here and start with experience, start with human encounter and try and build a bridge back to physics and chemistry. But just starting with physics and chemistry is not going to get you there. You keep running up against the wall of the hard problem of consciousness. But having said all of that, even if we achieve a thorough neuroscience of consciousness, which I hope we do, that will always still leave some questions unanswered. And it was Chalmers himself that said finding a correlate is not the same as an explanation. Why does consciousness exist in the first place? And for that kind of question, the sciences will never be able to answer that, and were never intended to answer questions of purpose and those kind of bigger kinds of explanations. And that's where my Christian faith and theistic position is so helpful, because then we can say, well, look, if we entertain the possibility that God exists, does that help us in answering that kind of why question, that bigger question of why does this even exist in the first place? And, I have a very vivid memory as a child of being sat by a window looking out at the rain, and suddenly the question coming into my head, why do I exist? Why do I think? Why am I a thinking being that experiences life? And I wasn't religious. I wasn't raised in a religious family. That question appeared seemingly from nowhere, and I don't think I'm alone in having those kind of questions. But the sciences alone and physical systems alone are not enough to answer them. And yet, if God exists, we have a basis that undergirds our understanding of why consciousness exists. Because if God exists, then physical systems were not what we began with. We began with God, and God is a conscious being. The very first sentence of the Bible says, in the beginning, God. And physical systems are a product of the work and creative work of this God. And therefore, consciousness precedes everything physical. And therefore, we can say, well, it exists because God exists, and we are kind of made in his image with his fingerprint, with his imprint. And so we are conscious because God is conscious and has made human beings to be a little bit like him. And so I feel like there's a lot of explanatory power in the Christian theism and how we think about consciousness, that just chalking it down to physics and chemistry, however complex and however kind of impressively sounding it is not going to answer that question to its fullness.
Right. And we're just going to wrap up within the next couple of minutes, maybe 3 to 4 minutes. This is one question that I wanted to ask you before we wrap up. Um, what is happening in the existence of an animal? Do animals like chimpanzees and creatures, do they have a form of mind? And this question became fascinating to me because I saw this interaction between Deepak Chopra and Michael Shermer. And Deepak Chopra, of course, holds to this pantheistic sort of extreme in view, and he was talking about how cells have consciousness. Obviously, I'm not asking about the consciousness of cells, but we see animals behaving, responding, and we see cells finding out about antibodies entering, about germs entering the body, and antibodies reacting, and all of that. Uh, what is happening there? Do these creatures and cells have minds, or how do we explain their behavior?
Yes, I think that's a great question. I think if I just begin with your question about animal consciousness and then move on to the panpsychist side of it, because there are different ways of viewing that. I think that it is clear anyone that has a domestic pet of, dog, cat, variety and some others would be convinced that they do have some degree of emotional life, that they can become excited and pleased to see you, they become scared, and so they do seem to have some level of awareness. But I think a number of sort of behavioral scientists in the animal fields would make the point that they seem to have an awareness of their external environment and they are responsive to their external environment. But we do not know, and we can't verify whether they have that kind of internal self-awareness. Do they fall into bed at the end of the day and say, oh, I had a really hard day today? Or are they actually more just driven by where their next meal is coming from, what their owner is doing? And many would say that they only begin to exhibit human-like qualities if it's through human interaction and training that comes from a human being. And some scientists say that the most highly trained chimpanzee will never exceed the ability of a 4-year-old child, and they will only reach that if a human being made in the image of God actually initiates the training. They wouldn't seek it out for themselves. And so there is still something distinctly different between even the most advanced primate and the most primitive human in our kind of ancestry. And so how do we account for that distinction? And then if we go to the rest of the animal kingdom, and then down into the kind of atomic scale and all kinds of levels. I mean, so the panpsychist view would say that there are elements of consciousness in every living thing, including electrons. And this is a really interesting view, and I think it's helpful to have it alongside a theistic view, because that at least enables the conversation to move away from just physical starting points. But it does have some limitations in the sense that it's impossible to verify whether an electron is conscious. And in any case, what does that mean? Another limitation is, how do you account for the unity of consciousness if we are made up of billions of conscious elements? If it's true that every particle in us has some degree of consciousness, why don't we have 3 trillion distinct conscious experiences? Why do we have just one? So it doesn't really account for the unity of consciousness that we experience. And it also doesn't account for this sort of step shift difference between primates and humans in the language that we have, and then this reflexive self-awareness that humans uniquely seem to have that animals don't. And so there are some very helpful aspects of this view, but there are also some big questions that it leaves unanswered, that I arguably Christian theism would, argue that we're right to say consciousness undergirds the cosmos, but it's personal and it's particular to human beings, although there are elements of it in animals as well.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much, Sharon Dirckx, for being on the podcast and engaging with these. This is such a huge topic to go in with, and your audience, I think this talk itself will get you pumped up to get hold of Dr. Sharon's book, Am I Just My Brain? And I'll be dropping it in the links, and you can definitely go and get hold of it. So that will be sort of like an entry-level book for a layperson to engage with this topic. Am I right? And
absolutely, yes.
is after they get through that book, for a layperson, not for someone who deals with neuroscience, but for a layperson, after they get through that book, is there a sort of an intermediate book that comes to your mind that you would quickly suggest?
Well, there are a number of recommendations in the back. There's God and the Brain by Bradley Sickler. That would be another great next one, God and the Brain.
Yeah, and for those who are very nerdy and geeky, you can take a look at the Blackwell Companion to Substance Dualism, which goes into huge depths on the topic, but that would be like an expert level book. So I'll be dropping the links to all of these books, and especially to Dr. Sharon's book. And once again, Dr. Sharon, thank you for being here with us, and we hope you had a great experience with us.
It was a pleasure to join you. Thanks for having me.
And thank you guys for joining in, and we will see you in the next one. Take care and God bless.